Okay, so I'm very excited to be hosting today's webinar. I'm going to get started and introduce a little bit about BECC, the webinar series itself, and where we are, and then I'll turn it over to our speaker for the day, actually Willens, pardon me. So my name is Dr. Ruben Zussman, and I am physically, well, when I'm at the office, working at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE. And I'm online co-hosting this with Maxine Chicumbo, who's our communications associate. ACEEE is one of the co-conveners of BECC, and we're a research and advocacy nonprofit that works to advance energy efficiency policies, programs, and technologies, and investments in behaviors. If you want to know more about ACEEE, you can check us out at aceeee.org. So I'm the director of the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at ACEEE, which means I lead research on human behavior and energy efficiency, as well as co-chairing the annual Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, or BECC. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to send our best wishes to those who are affected by the coronavirus, COVID-19, or those who have family or friends that are affected. At BECC, we are aware and actively planning for the evolving uncertainty associated with the virus. BECC is a community, and as you are valued members of our community, we are committed to working with you to provide expected value from our event and maximum flexibility. So rest assured that the conference will go forward in some form, and we encourage you to submit an abstract before the deadline if you are considering speaking. So for our full plan, you can go to beccconference.org. You can also check us out there for more updates. And actually, during our next webinar, we'll specifically focus on climate impacts of the coronavirus. So just to change gears again, I know it's hard to think about assembling with other people at a time like this, but I do want to assure you that BECC is an excellent place for networking. Last year's conference was a resounding success. We had 540 attendees, a suite of excellent speakers and presenters, and great networking and social activities. We had 6 plenaries, 42 general conference sessions, and more than 200 speakers selected through a competitive abstract process. So BECC is a unique conference is that it brings together individuals who don't always have the chance to meet and network and share knowledge. In 2019, about half of the people that were attended were new to the conference. They came from 37 US states and 17 foreign countries. They represented utilities, governments, research firms, nonprofits, consulting groups, and universities. Almost 60 of the attendees were students, including grad students and postdocs, many of them joining as BECC Fellows under the competitive scholarship program. So this year, we're especially excited for BECC 2020 because the conference takes place just after the 2020 elections. Whatever the outcome, BECC will be ready to lend a hand in showing how behavioral science can play a role in crafting policy and programs to achieve a sustainable and equitable energy future. And of course, before we get started, I would like to extend a special thank you to our BECC 2020 sponsor organizations. Without these sponsors' help, the conference and these webinars could not happen. So if you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor, we have flexibility options for you for just about any budget. Please send us an email and we'd be happy to chat more with you about it. And of course, I wanted to mention BECC is accepting abstracts now. The call for abstracts has been extended and the deadline for submitting your 300-word individual or panel presentation is now April 15th. Although a new hot tip is that it could be extended further. As of yet, that's not official, but stay tuned. We might extend it again because of the coronavirus. In any event, do start thinking about what you're going to submit and get to the conference website to submit it. Even if you're unsure if you're going to attend the conference, I do recommend submitting an abstract now so that you have the option. And we'd love to see you all at BECC 2020, which is in Washington, DC, December 6th to 9th. So today we're presenting the 3rd webinar in our 2020 series, but the 4th webinar coming up after this one, you might want to register now because it's also going to be awesome. We're talking about climate change in the time of coronavirus. And as a community, we'll be impacted. And so we want to share with you how the COVID virus is affecting climate change and talk to you about the potential impacts on behavior and our community as BECC community and the larger community. So it'll be co-chairs of BECC co-chairs Beth Carlin of the Sea Change Institute, and Chris Jones of the Cool Climate Network, as well as some other guests that are still being confirmed. But be sure to tune in because it will be of great interest. Okay, logistics. All attendees are currently in listening only mode. Following Ashley's remarks, we'll be opening the webinar up to questions. So throughout the presentation, please type your questions into the chat box and we will address them during the Q&A period. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and we will send a link along with the potentially along with the mini survey, probably just the link to this particular webinar this time, to registrants after the webinar. So that's it for the logistics and preamble. I'm very excited about today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Ashley Willens. She's at the Harvard Business School. And in both 2018 and 2015, she was named a Rising Star of Behavioral Science by the International Behavioral Exchange. In 2017, she started a nudge unit in the British Columbia provincial government, one of the best places on earth, I might add, where I used to live, where she looked at how to use behavioral science to encourage large-scale policy change. She has published her research in numerous academic journals and popular media outlets, including Harvard Business Review, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Her new book, Time Smart: How to Reclaim Your Time and Live a Happier Life, is available for pre-order from Amazon and will be published by Harvard Business Publishing in October of 2020. So today's webinar is on how nudges can influence transportation behavior and encourage large-scale change at the local level. Thank you, Ashley, for leading today's webinar. I'm now going to give you control over the webinar, and you can share your webcam and get started.
Great.
Okay, so I've given you control. You should be able to accept it now.
I think it's just taking a second.
I apologize if my sound has gone out. Can anybody confirm that you can hear me now? You can simply text that into the chat box. Okay. Okay, a lot of yeses, great. So I just wanted to reiterate that any information you need will be on the BECC website, and please submit an abstract as soon as possible. Actually, please feel free to share your screen and get started as soon as you like.
So sorry, didn't actually send me the push notification to take over.
Oh, I'm sorry. For some reason, it was sent to the wrong person. Okay. Yeah, that's frustrating. I'm not sure why it's not allowing me to make you the presenter. I'm going to do that now. Okay, Ashley, I believe you should be able to take control now. One moment while I make you the presenter again.
Okay.
All right, there you go. Now you should be the presenter. Please take control and go ahead and begin.
Perfect. Okay, great. That's what you get for, I feel like no matter what you do in a dress rehearsal, when the show starts, it's always a new challenge, but there we go, we figured it out. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm just gonna minimize this, I think, here, so that everyone can see my screen, hopefully. Okay. So thank you so much for having me today. I will try to get a lot of information in 30 minutes so we can have lots of time for a Q&A. I will briefly just provide an overview of the talk. I'm going to just provide a brief overview of behavioral insights. Now, I know this will kind of be old hat to some people on the webinar today, so I'm going to just go through the basic kind of framework that I use to think about questions from a behavioral insights perspective. Then I'm going to talk about a set of projects that my student and I led, trying to shift people out of their cars and into more sustainable and active commutes. And then a set of projects that we're currently working on with the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke. So there'll be kind of some hot off the presses new research that I'm happy to share. As Ruben already mentioned, I am I'm a social psychologist by training, but have spent a lot of the last few years of, sort of my academic career, if you will. So I sort of consider myself a practical academic. I'm trying to use the insights from social psychology and sociology, economics to solve policy relevant problems. So I've been spending the last several years trying to, look at how we can use the principles of behavioral economics and behavioral science to help people live happier and healthier lives. I became really interested in behavioral science around the last couple of years of my PhD at the University of British Columbia, where I was, as was already mentioned, a behavioral scientist for the provincial government. And that's where I became particularly interested in trying to apply what we know from social psychology to work on large-scale social problems, such as how to reduce carbon emissions. So we know that most policy actually involves behavior change, regardless of what kind of policy decisions we're looking at. So regardless of whether we're trying to get people to recycle more, to save more for the future, or to engage in healthier behaviors like drinking less and exercising more. And we also know that people have the best intentions. So we know we really want to kind of, especially right now, and this has been a struggle for me, but we want to maintain being fit and active, but often our behaviors don't exactly align with our best intentions. So we might kind of imagine ourselves as a marathon runner and yet find ourselves spending more time on the couch staring at our running shoes than actually going for a run in the first place. And this is in part because we kind of aspire and think that we're going to do all of these behaviors in the future, and often don't make those decisions in the present moment. We're a bit present bias. And there's been a whole line of research that was really popularized by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein around how we can actually help people make better decisions that are more in line with this ideal version of themselves. We want to be healthy, we want to be happy, we want to be safe, we want to save a lot for the future, we want to do all of these things that will pay off in the future, but our current actions don't always align with our overall best intentions. So Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein have this quote in their book that I really like from Nudge. If you haven't read this, I recommend everyone goes ahead and reads this book. But it says, how can people be simultaneously so smart and so dumb? And this is a direct quote from the book Nudge, and it's the direct question that behavioral insights tries to answer. So this is also behavioral insights. It's also known as behavioral economics or nudging, and it's about using knowledge or insights from behavioral science, the psychology, and economics to build better public policy, and doing that using experimental methodology, and trying to kind of help people act on their smart intentions that they don't always follow through with in everyday life. A lot of the research kind of from behavioral economics relies on this basic understanding of system 1 and system 2 processing. Now it's a little bit more complicated than what's pictured here, but this is just sort of a basic kind of framework for understanding how people make decisions. And Kirk and Spock are two of the most iconic characters in sci-fi history, and they're going to illustrate the two cognitive systems in our brains that influence how we make decisions and explain why it's sometimes hard for us to do the right thing. So according to the scientific literature, again, within reason, this is a little bit kind of extrapolated for the purpose of illustration, there are two distinct systems that influence behavior and our ability to make sound decisions. So system 1 is the automatic system that processes many things simultaneously and subconsciously, takes mental shortcuts, and is subject to bias. So you can think of Kirk here, fast, emotional, and you're relying on instincts to make decisions. This could be, daily commute. You just kind of well, when we were all commuting. So now our habits are disrupted, which I'll talk about in a second, might be a good time to be leveraging some of these behavioral insights when workplaces come back online to fundamentally shift people's behavior, but maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A. Cravings, speaking in a mother tongue. These are kind of automatic systems. They happen by default. They're based on deeply ingrained habits that build up over time. Now, we also have this more system 2 or reflective system that processes things more slowly and in a more rational, deliberate, and deductive way. So we want to think about SPOC here. This usually relies on logic, is effortful, relies on self-awareness. So when we're learning a foreign language, we kind of think twice when we're about to say something. When we're on a diet, we might, kind of put in that cognitive effort to try to be changing the way we eat on an everyday basis, or when we're planning to go somewhere unfamiliar, or when we're changing our commuting habits, we have to kind of think twice, think again, to think about how we're going to get to where we want to go. So most of policy up until, when nudge came out and behavioral economics really started to play an important role in shaping public policy, we sort of built our policies for this SPOC character. So we build policies for someone who's rational and methodical, who's going to read dense forms and letters full of legalese, who's going to go through the trouble of researching information and options on difficult to navigate websites, and who's going to objectively weigh all of the pertinent information and make the best decision. So that's where a lot of, historically our policies have been built. But as it turns out, we make a lot of decisions based on, fast, effortless, automatic, uncontrolled processes. So we're actually, our decisions are often driven a lot more by emotion, by gut instinct, what we think other people are doing. We're swayed by things like language and message framing, and we're highly influenced by our peers and other subtle and not so subtle cues in our environment. So we're not as rational as we might hope or expect. And this is especially true in this day and age. And I don't know if anyone's felt like this with all the kind of information about COVID going around, but this can be especially true when we're easily overwhelmed by information and options. And there's just a plethora of information and options about most of the decisions we're making on an everyday basis that can be really overwhelming. So although, we would like to be able to synthesize all of the knowledge out there when we're making a particular decision, it's especially when we're kind of overwhelmed by choice or options, we might rely more on system 1 thinking than we would like to admit. But what the nice thing about behavioral economics does is kind of say, we can formalize these heuristics and biases that people use to make decisions. And I'm not going to go through all of these biases, but there's textbooks out there on all these kinds of biases that get in the way of making good decisions. And all of these different ways that we synthesize information, rely on heuristics, have predictable and observable impacts on the way we make decisions, and how both citizens and public servants make decisions. So policymakers are people, and they can be both individuals and policymakers are subject to these biases, but by understanding them, we can then use the knowledge that we have about the psychological biases that exist to help us make better decisions. So when we're thinking about promoting environmental behavior, sustainable, more active and healthy commutes, when we're thinking about shifting people's decision-making in these domains, we might, think about using legislation like no-take zones, trade bans, emission standards, product bans. We might think about incentives like taxes or financial gain for doing things like recycling or not taking plastic bags to the grocery store. And we might also think about providing people with information. So this is like your awareness campaign, education, and labeling products so people know that they're sustainable. And these can all be highly effective strategies. But, they're designed mostly for this individual rational decision maker who responds to economic incentive or risk of incrimination, who updates their beliefs in response to new information, acts consistently with knowledge and values. So we also need to think about, and as behavioral scientists, we're also thinking about appealing more to system 1 thinking. That's more emotional, that capitalizes on the fact we care what other people think about us, and takes into consideration the fact that people are often stubborn in their beliefs, but inconsistent. So, a lot of the research I've conducted finds that some of these subtle psychological framing of trying to encourage people to engage in environmental behavior for pro-social reasons versus financial reasons, kind of happens independently of how much people say that they care about being a pro-environmental person. So we know that our attitudes there's an intention action gap, and that our beliefs do not always translate into our behavior. So there's been some success in our field. I just want to make sure that, okay, cool. There's been some success in our field around interventions that capitalize on behavioral science that wouldn't necessarily influence Spock, but would influence Kirk or work on human beings. And some of these are as follows. So there's been research by the Behavioral Insights team, who I do some of this work with, showing that just opting people in, so making the environmentally sustainable choice, automatically enrolling people to use a renewable energy can increase, and then providing them with the option to opt out if that's not something that they want to engage in. So it's choice preserving, but kind of makes the environmental sustainable option the easiest option, can significantly increase the number of people who participate in strategies like using renewable energy. We also can see that simple strategies like just simply removing the tray in a canteen can reduce food waste. And this is, again, because trays are a little bit annoying to carry, so taking them away makes taking less food more convenient. So you'll only take one plate as opposed to multiple plates, and as a result, you'll waste less. There's also been a lot of research, and some of these results have kind of, shown effects such that they decrease over time. So they seem really effective immediately, but then the effectiveness of the messages kind of goes away over time. So that's one thing we can talk about and think a little bit more about. But just knowing how your energy consumption compares to that of your neighbors can significantly reduce your own energy consumption, because we like to know that we're doing at least as well as our peers, if not better. And so this is capitalizing on making things social. And then we also want to think about, employing strategies that can help make sustainable options timely. So they capitalize on the fact that people are already making changes to deeply ingrained habits like commuting. So cycle share schemes are more effective when you target people who are moving. And this timeliness component is really important when you're thinking about disrupting people's habits. So you could think about a lot of the strategies that I'm going to talk about and share might be particularly effective when people are coming back to work after, this quarantine that we're in that people's normal habits are already disrupted. So they might be more willing to change their commuting habits so significantly when they go back to work now, since it's going to be a fresh start for them. They're already going to have to kind of, their habits have already been disrupted. So thinking about timing in the case of shifting people's commutes is also really important. So these are examples underlie kind of 4 key principles that we use when we're thinking about designing interventions to shift people out of driving alone and into more sustainable and alternative commutes. So we want to think about making it easy. So how can we make the sustainable option, the healthy option, the easiest option? How can we make it more attractive? This one is pretty similar to making it easier. How can we make it social? We know that people are social creatures. So how can we capitalize on the fact that we care what other people think of us? And how can we make it timely? How can we capitalize on other changes that people are already making? So this is kind of just a brief overview of the approach that we take. We're usually focused a little bit more on framing of messages versus incentives, that are fundamentally changing the value proposition of a behavior, although that does play an important role, particularly around commuting, and that's something we can also talk about. And so my team and I really wanted to understand how we might be able to use some of these principles from behavioral science to make active commuting easier, more attractive, more social, and timely. How can we use some of these strategies to help people stop driving alone so much and engage more in active commuting? We thought that this was an important issue to tackle because transportation sector produces about 23% of energy-related emissions, which amounts to 14% of all global emissions. And as the world becomes increasingly urbanized and population density grows, the demand for transportation services within urban areas is also increasing. And we know that motor vehicles alone account for about 75% of urban air pollution, depending on the statistics you look at. And we also know that 128 million people in the US commute to work by car. And over 3/4 choose to commute alone in their cars. So we wanted to know how we might be able to shift people from driving alone to either carpooling or taking public transit or engaging in more active forms of transportation. So how do we get people out of these single occupancy vehicle commutes without changing infrastructure, without changing heavy-handed, financial incentives? So we think about answering these kinds of complex problems, again, without relying on policy or monetary rewards and punishments. And we really want to also make sure that the options or the experiments we're running use non-coercive, weaker incentives that are choice preserving. So we're not kind of forcing people to make one decision or another, but really preserving the choice and trying to strongly encourage people to at least consider sometimes engaging in more active forms of commuting. We do this using rigorous randomized control trials, which I'm gonna not go into too much. And we also kind of keep in mind the idea that small changes to the environment and the framing of our choices can have a big impact. So kind of how we see what the medium-sized option is here depends on what cups are what options are surrounding this middle option. Similarly, a lot of these decisions can be framed just simply through messaging or by the other options that are presented alongside of them. So we're really thinking, how can we frame some of these decisions around commuting in ways that are going to be palatable and exciting for people to kind of help them shift from driving alone to some of these alternative modes. And just one example that I like is, you want to think about motivating. And one thing I always try to keep in mind when I'm designing my studies, you don't necessarily want to think about motivating people for the so-called right reasons, but think about motivating people by capitalizing on the motivations they already have. So sometimes when we're trying to get people to do the sustainable thing or the healthy thing or the happier thing, we're like, well, why don't we just tell them it's more sustainable and healthier and happier? And like, that's good and everything, but people have many competing demands, and sometimes we need to know what motivation is most salient to them at that time of the decision. So there's a study where they were trying to get people to reuse their towels more in a hotel. And just framing that decision as helping to save the environment was somewhat effective. Saying that 75% of guests reuse their towels was even more effective, and then saying that 75% of guests in this room reuse their towels was the most effective at getting people to reuse their towels more. And this capitalizes on the fact we care what other people think of us, but also we're sometimes more likely to change our behavior if we know that people can tell if we change our behavior, especially in moral domains where people want to seem like a good person, like they're doing the right thing. There's been another study by one of my colleagues, Razioli, and his team at MIT, and they were trying to get people, and I won't go into the details of this study, but to uptake, kind of surge protection in their apartments. And they found that getting people to sign a sign-up sheet in the lobby of the apartment was way more effective at increasing enrollment in this program that was really energy efficient than getting people to enroll over email. And that's because people's behavior was visible and people want to seem like a good person. So and they also don't want to seem like a jerk. So they don't want to seem like the only person in the apartment who's not doing this thing that's going to save money and make their power more, sustainable, more likely to be kind of reliable for everyone in the building. And so this was especially effective in apartment buildings. And this, one second. Hold on one second. One second. This is what you get from working from home. Sorry. One second. Hey, honey. The perils of apartment working. All right. But people were way more likely to sign up here when the sign-up sheet was visible. And this was especially true around people who owned their own apartments because they really want their neighbors to like them in this case, since they own and they're probably going to stick around for a while. So this is just to say that social messaging can be really effective. And we wanted to see if we could apply some of these principles to active commuting strategies. So I've already explained to you why we might care about this behavior, and everyone on the webinar obviously cares about this behavior. So we wanted to understand, hold on one second. Okay, cool. We wanted to understand whether we could shift people from single occupancy vehicle commutes into other kinds of modes. So we tried a variety of different strategies from the behavioral science literature. We worked with a large employer of about 70,000 employees. And that was pretty well connected to various, subway, train, carpool options. And we tried strategies that I've already kind of discussed that might be effective based on what we know from the behavioral science literature. So we told people that their peers, their colleagues were really interested in carpooling. So we're particularly interested in carpooling here. We also engaged loss framing. So for people, losses loom larger than gains. So we reminded them by driving, because they'd have to pay for gas, that they would actually be losing money every day. But some of these alternative modes of transportation, like taking transit and carpooling, could help them save money. We also use peer testimonials, again, capitalizing on this, making it social. So saying, carpooling here was really easy and they found a match. We made the decision easier for people. So we said, here are 3 employees you could carpool with now. Again, trying to make the decision really easy. We know that people like free things, so we tried a free bus trial to get people to use transit more. And we also use personalized travel plans. So this is going to come up in a study that I'm going to go through really quickly in a couple of slides. We know from a lot of the TDM literature that telling people how they could get to work via transit, so making the decision-making process around active commute simpler, can be really effective. So we also had a treatment arm where we looked at personalized travel plans. Maybe we thought that that would help people kind of actively commute or carpool. And we also had a really specific call to action. So we said, sign up now, it's easy. And so you can see we designed a series of experiments to try to test out these behavioral science interventions on matching, free bus trials, personalized travel plans, a call to action, peer testimonials, loss framing, and social norms. And we picked these given the extant literature that I presented already in the course of this talk, showing that these behavioral strategies can work in other domains. And we wanted to look at reductions in single occupancy vehicles, rides, and uptaking in public transportation, and uptake of carpool. And we actually found, and so people might have seen on this webinar, might have seen this paper that just came out in Nature Human Behavior about a month ago. We didn't find any effect of these interventions on people's active commuting behaviors in this case. And so, we found slight enrollment benefits. So when we said, here are 3 matches in your area of people you could carpool with, people are more likely to open the email saying they were interested. So we did see that study 1 here. We did see that these kind of treatments kind of making the process easier, as one would expect, did increase enrollment, but it didn't increase follow through. I think a really important point here is we made these interventions based on what people were telling us. Employees were telling us they would carpool if we made it easier for them, if we matched them to other colleagues. Employees were telling us that if we gave them personalized travel plans, they'd be more likely to commute. Employees were telling us if we implemented free bus trials, they would definitely try it. But again, our behaviors don't always line up with our best intentions, and commuting is a deeply ingrained habitual behavior. When you're, running around trying to get the kids ready to get them off to school, it can be really challenging to also think, well, now I need to kind of commute in a different way today or this morning than what I usually do. But I'm optimistic, so our team has not failed here just because we couldn't shift commuting in this one particular case. We just found a boundary condition to a behavioral science intervention. So we know what the study highlighted for us is this intention action gap that I was mentioning at the top of this presentation is real. So we need to think, if we're really serious about reducing single occupancy vehicle commutes, we need to make driving harder and potentially the more expensive, or at least the more friction. We need to build more friction into driving and less friction into public transportation and into carpooling. We also did a lot in our messaging to highlight social benefits, and there's some great research by Mario Small, who's a sociologist at Harvard, showing that we're actually more likely to confide in people that we've never interacted with before, that we're never going to interact with again, like our barber or our taxi driver. And so in these closed loops, like in an workplace organization, anonymity and retaining anonymity, or at least being able to have the flexibility to mix up your carpool, might be really important, given that people might have varying degrees of comfort with kind of being very social with their work colleagues on their commutes. And then again, we want to think about maybe we should be targeting employees while they're already changing their behavior. So we have some studies in the field now trying to onboard people into more active commuting strategies and programs that already exist via some wonderful partners that we have at the new employee experience, right when a new employee has moved offices, because we really think that we missed out on an opportunity to encourage people's behavior, since we were focusing on employees who kind of had their routine down, as opposed to new employees who might be more open to trying something new. We also might need heavier-handed interventions to really move the needle on getting people to mode shift. So we found that cash incentives to refer a friend for bike sharing programs is more effective than cash to donate. So more active commuting strategies might feel a little bit riskier, especially when you're recommending them to others. So people might need to be more compensated for changing their behavior, especially when this change might feel uncertain. And we might want to try to ingrain these habits earlier, such as by working with college students. So we're currently working with college campuses around the US to ingrain active and healthier commutes, so we can kind of instill this habit earlier. We also need continued collaboration to understand when incentives and framing works and for whom. So to this end, I'm going to kind of share a couple of early results that we have with my partners at the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University. So they're working with the city of Durham as part of the Mayor's Innovation Challenge, which is a Bloomberg initiative that they won funding for. And they've also been working on this question of how to shift people out of their cars and into more active and sustainable commutes. So we've all been working on this question together. And I'm just going to share the results of 2 studies before opening up to Q&A that we've run that have actually shown some success here. So in the study that I presented with 70,000 employees and trying a bunch of behavioral science strategies, parking was free. And there was lots of parking spots, so you can kind of imagine that that was undercutting any benefit of the intervention. But here in these contexts, we don't have those constraints. So the cost benefit analysis, these behavioral interventions might work a little bit better, and we can have a conversation about that as well. So in these studies, we tested kind of 2 interventions that I've already mentioned a little bit, personalized routes and bus lotteries. So a lottery incentive for free bus passes. And we iterated and improved our solution. So the personalization of the routes, you can see kind of got clearer and better, simpler, easier to understand as we iterated with our partners. So we wanted to make it personal. One thing that's really important in messaging is you make it personal and targeted to that individual, and that's where these personalized route plans are really effective. You know, you can see here we're also highlighting some different benefits. So some people might be differentially sensitive to health concerns, hours, or money. Everyone has kind of different motive, but health, finances, and time are really among people's top motivations. So you can see the messages here kind of target someone who might be concerned both about health, time savings, also financial savings. So you can see that the personalization here highlighted really clearly how they were going to benefit if they stopped driving and started commuting via taking transit in this case, and made it personalized to them. And I think this is one thing that might have really helped make these personalized routes very effective. And we did all of this through focus groups. And so you can see here that everyone has transit options both for the bus and cycling, and if walking was too hard, we just scrapped that altogether. But we didn't want it to seem overly difficult. So we ran this experiment where we compared personalized route emails against a bus lottery, and then there was, some people were assigned to get both a personalized route email and a bus lottery. And we can see from the experiment here, from our experimental results, that we saw a 9.3% reduction in drive alone trips and a 9.3% increase in sustainable trips, which is either biking or taking transit, in both the personalized route and the personalized and bus lottery conditions. So you can actually see the personalized route condition is kind of net overall a little bit more effective. The lottery didn't really seem to have that much of a kind of additional increase above and beyond the personalized route, which seemed to be quite effective here. So personalized routes can be effective. Perhaps the messaging was better in this experiment as opposed to our previous one. And just maybe the options were again, when seen against driving, seemed more beneficial. I think really understanding the who and when these messages and interventions are most effective is a really important next step for the field. Importantly, we also made people happier, healthier, and wealthier. These are the 3 metrics that behavioral scientists like to see, that we're making citizens happier, healthier, and better off financially. So people in our experimental conditions were more likely, so personalized route or personalized route plus bus lottery put together, were very happy or completely happy with their commute. They were more likely to say this, probably because they were getting more exercise. We know active commuting strategies are better for well-being and reduce stress more as compared to driving alone, which is one of the worst time use activities that people spend their time on each day in large-scale nationally representative samples. They were also almost twice as likely to exercise on their commute. Again, kind of, I think these 2 things go together highly. And they were also likely to say that their commute was less expensive, so they weren't paying for parking or gas and so on. So these results, take them with a kind of grain of salt here, but if we scaled to the entire city of Durham, 9 million miles would not be driven as a result of these personalized travel plans. So they won an innovation prize for this, and then got funding to run a second study with college students at North Carolina Central University. They conducted some exploratory surveys, which are important in this context, user tested the interventions, and then conducted interviews, and then randomly assigned students to one of 3 conditions. Control just did the surveys where they self-reported how they commuted. The Smart Trip got 2 Smart Trip emails, again, personalized action plans, and the emails served as reminders. And Smart Trip Plus, you get that same personalized set of messages, but then 2 further emails, which again serve as sort of reminders. So they had the personalized action plan. Here, the personalization was a little bit less specific. So it just says you're going to avoid parking pain and save money. It doesn't say how much. The first study was a little bit more detailed there. And this is just a general design. But what we can see here, again, is a 7.1% reduction in drive-alone trips and a 6.5% increase in sustainable trips. This is statistically significant, but we just want to kind of say that we are relying on self-report data here, whereas the first study we had actual ridership data. But we're pretty confident that these personalized routes were effectively getting people to move out of driving alone into more sustainable modes. And you can see here that the personalized route plus was particularly effective. And again, this capitalizing on keeping these sustainable options salient in people's minds, I think is a really important point, and what this personalized route plus is capitalizing on. So we have a few upcoming studies that I'm going to just spend a couple minutes talking about, and then I'm almost at the end of my presentation. So when we're trying to get people to visualize their time off, so we know that thinking about a reward for reaching a goal and how it could thinking about a reward from reaching a goal and how it could increase its motivation to get it. But if the goal requires too much time or effort to complete, visualization can backfire. So we're just going to ask people, well, if you had more time off as a function of commuting in a different way, what are you going to do? How are you going to spend this time? How are you going to feel? How will you feel at work? So, you know, this is one example of, sorry, just visualizing your time off, but we want people to take the same visualization around planning their commute. So we want people to think about the sustainable modes they're going to use, which route they're going to use, if they're going to change their routines, what might happen if they try to change their routines. So if they want to bike and it rains, what are they going to do? Getting people to really think through the process of changing their commute prior to doing it. And this can actually reduce the amount of excuse making that people do on the day. So if they're like, well, I can't bike now because it rained, if we actually get people to think about these kind of other factors that might get in the way from people changing their behavior before they're in that kind of hot state trying to actually get to work, we think that this might effectively help people change their behavior. We're also going to look at the role of commitment contracts. So we know when we personally pledge to do something, and especially if our colleagues or someone around us can see it, or even our kids, we have some research showing that parents who publicly commit to giving to charity in front of their kids are more likely to follow through because they want to teach their kid a positive example and seem like a good person. So we're really interested in this idea of commitments. So Joey is my collaborator on this project. So getting people to say, I, Joey, commit to earning time off by commuting 8 times per week by using the following sustainable modes, bike. So getting people to pledge, commit, and then follow through in their behaviors might be particularly effective as well. We're also interested in some parking pricing studies, and we're working on some research projects in and along these domains where we're going to try to unbundle parking payments so users will pay daily or weekly instead of monthly to increase the experience pain of payment. So the payments are really salient, so people might consider driving less since they can really feel every time that they pay for parking. We're looking at incremental pricing, so price to park increases the more frequently a user parks in a given period. Parking cash outs, so they could receive a cash payment in exchange for declining a parking space, or pre-commitment, again, asking users to commit a number of days that they will drive in a period and increase the price and effort required to park for additional days. So again, really around this idea of how can you make active commuting options, sustainable options easier and parking harder, which I was alluding to earlier. And then of course, congestion pricing is something, we're not doing research on this directly yet, but something we're always considering. And then fare-free public transportation, financial incentives, and then non-financial incentives. And there's been some good research on this in other jurisdictions. And we're kind of focusing our next set of projects on parking pricing and how can we frame parking pricing to make it feel more psychologically salient, but there's other policy levers as well that I just mentioned. So I'm going to open it up to questions now, but I want to thank first my collaborators, Holly Dykstra, Ariella Cristal, who are both at Harvard and are PhD students there work in my lab, Shabil at King's College London, Jessica Roberts of Ulta Planning and Design, who's really been kind of our leader in helping us form partnerships with cities and other TDM professionals, and then Joey Sherlock, who's been leading the Durham projects, and he's at the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University. So with that, I'll kind of leave it open to questions, and I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Ashley. That was a great talk and really interesting. I'm really glad you were able to do it despite the technical difficulties earlier and various issues with working from home. We have about 10 minutes to go over some questions, and Maxine has been diligently keeping track of all the questions that have been coming in. There's lots of, we had over 300 people earlier on this webinar, and lots of questions coming in. So Maxine, if you're on the line, maybe you could ask Ashley a few questions.
Sure. Yeah, we have a bunch of questions here.
Great.
We'll through them and shoot some at you, Ashley. So one question here is, well, it's actually a two-part question. Is there any follow-up to see how the observed changes have been persistent and whether or not they've influenced other people? And then the second part to that question is, to what extent does route complexity, like bus changes and schedules and distance, impact conversion rates?
Yeah, so the persistent change is really important. In the Durham studies, we're able to observe change over the period of 6 to 8 weeks. Given COVID and the current kind of hiatus on university campuses, we're not going to be able to kind of go back to that same group of people in survey, but I think in general, looking at long-term persistent changes is really important and something that we're going to kind of do as much as we can. In terms of the social network effects, we're starting to now work with a UK startup called Faxi, which will actually, they're a carpooling app that matches employees in certain regions and then provides them with parking that's closer to work, so they get priority parking. And they're actually able and sharing with us now these sort of like, what this person is referring to is this idea of a network nudge. So if my partner who's cooking and was making noise because he's cooking dinner, that's what he was doing right now, I'm so lucky. But anyway, so if he starts active commuting, does that affect my commuting habits? Does that affect someone I know? Do I start wanting to carpool, so then I go and try to get someone to carpool that I work with? Right now, our data is limited, so we don't know how the people in our data sets know each other, but we're actively working on a project right now to look at if I nudge Umer, my partner's commute, how does that affect the other people in his network? Because we're going to kind of capitalize on social media data as part of this tech platform that we're working with. So that's a great question. We don't have data on that yet. And then in terms of scheduling, so there's been some great research. There's an AER, American Economic Review paper published maybe a handful of years ago, looking at when that disruptions to people's daily commutes is actually one of the major sources of persistent change. So when roads get disrupted and people have to find alternative routes to commute, they do, and those changes seem to persist at least over kind of a couple-year run. So I think scheduling our like transportation complexity is really important, and there's some startup apps that are trying to solve for this by showing people how they could get to leg 1, 2, 3 using a variety of different commutes modes. So, you know, there's some technology that's starting to try to solve for the complexity of commutes if you have to take like a bus, train, car, kind of, and like how do you even think about matching? So there's some startup platforms that are doing that and trying to solve for those complexities. But also the some of these route disruptions do indicate that if you can get people to change their commutes, either because it's something that you're enforcing or the ecosystem enforces it, that those can have long-term positive benefits for getting people to commute in more active and sustainable ways, because people form a new habit, a new normal. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens post-COVID if we can sustain some of these working from home policies. So I'm working on a project right now with a major financial consulting firm to look at this, to look at if client travel stays lower because a new normal is formed, and there's this like norm of legitimizing discussions around flexible work schedules. Do we really need to be on a client site every week? And obviously air travel is one of the worst carbon emission inputs. So I'm actually kind of actively working on a research project looking at how people's commuting for client projects persistently changes after people start going back to work after COVID.
Okay, and then yeah, speaking of the post-COVID period, somebody asked, you know, if we're going to take advantage of the post-COVID period as an attempt to influence transport choices, would this work need to begin before things revert back to normal?
I think it has to be like these options need to be presented when people make their first decision. Like, how do you get people to make their first decision when offices start reopening to change their commute prior to them actually like it being Monday, right? And like you just go and get in your car like you always did. So I do think that if we can get people to fundamentally change their first like set of commuting that they do like as offices open, that this will be critical. So can you offer an incentive? Can you lock people into committing? People are also affected financially right now. So can you provide some sort of financial benefit to, you know, or financial savings at least to not be driving into the office? So those are the kinds of things I would consider, and I would consider doing it. Yes, getting people to commit now to changing their commutes later. So getting people to pre-commit into changing their commuting so that they're not kind of making a decision in a hot state when they need to get somewhere, but are making it based on a choice that they've previously thought about.
Ashley, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but do you have a hard stop in 6 minutes, or can you go a little bit over?
I think I can go a little bit over, yeah.
Okay, we have a lot of questions.
Okay, I'm also happy to respond over email as well. But yeah, I think can do, yeah, so I can chat for and after 3:30. Sorry, I was
I'm just
checking.
asking 5-10 more minutes, and then we'll send you the remainder of the questions. All right, Maxine, go ahead.
Okay, there's also a couple of people asking about universities. So for example, will you please explain how to combine these messages and strategies? You know, where can we look for examples of universities and how they've implemented it?
Yeah, so we've been working a lot with Western Washington, and they have an active commuting strategy that runs across, you know, their university, like their college students and also their faculty. and they do a lot of kind of student-led initiatives. I'm part of rare.org, so the people on this webinar might be really interested to learn about rare.org. They're a consulting firm out of DC, and they've been putting together these campus organizing committees at university campuses and college campuses all over the US to get students to take ownership of sustainability kind of from the ground up. And I think anything to like, students want to have a voice and feel like they're actively participating. This is true for every demographic. We want to feel like we have choice over the decisions that are being made in our organizations, but this is particularly true for college students who are looking for a way to be useful. They're learning a lot in class and they want to actively participate in civic engagement initiatives. So RARE's been like coordinating efforts in college campuses where they host a symposium and get students really excited about trying to like come up with their own way of solving these issues and getting other students excited about active commuting, about sustainability. We have something at HBS. It's also the Sustainability Association, where every MBA section has a student sustainability leader. And I'm currently mentoring 10 MBA students who are trying to solve, trying to get people to commute by plane less and to be more active in their commuting. And I think the beauty of having these student-led focus groups is that the messages come from their own lived experience. They can do a much better job at telling me what other MBA students would be interested in, like discounts on Amtrak, so they don't have to fly to New York, but they can take a train than I am because I'm not a part of their peer group. So I think anything that we can do to have these active focus groups, and we found this in our own work too, are really effective. So, getting the people who you're trying to change on a call, on a conversation, and seeing what's going to land best with them and their colleagues. I think that's true everywhere, and particularly trying to involve college students in the process, I think is really effective. And I've seen it work really well, both at HBS, but also with some of these other university partners we've been working with.
Okay, another question here about one of the strategies you pointed out. Is it possible for people to be overwhelmed when they're surrounded by messaging, comparing them to their neighbors?
So there is some nuance around this effect. So I found in some of my own data that if you feel too far from the average, so there's sort of like a reference point effect, that if you feel like you're doing a bit worse, but not too much worse, then you're motivated. And if you feel like you're doing just so much worse that there's no hope for you, or then you just kind of discount the information. So I do think that, we need to be careful when we're using social norm information to try to motivate people's behavior. One, is it realistic? And how is it going to affect different people at different points in the threshold? If they're so far from the target, they might just give up altogether. So how can you build in meaningful and personalized targets? There's been a lot of research actually doing tailored messaging, so using kind of like machine learning, updating, looking at people's past energy consumption behaviors, and then inputting a goal that is kind of like maybe within the 5% range of change that might be possible for that person. So I think we need to be very careful here about kind of thinking that all these strategies will have a blanket net positive effect, and think about really start thinking about personalizing the message. We've seen in our own data that some of these messages around time and money saving only work if you're within 1 to 2 mile radius of a bus stop. Otherwise you're like, well, that's nice for that person that can take the bus, but that's not my experience. So it almost backfires. So we want to be thinking, who could these messages work for, and how can we make sure that we message selectively, much like marketing would or whatever, to use and capitalize on these insights where we think they're most likely to pay off and have a positive downstream impact.
Okay, thank you for that. We also have a few questions about employers. How to convince employers to make the changes we need to change the behavior of the employees?
So I think why I think I have a job at HBS as a social psychologist who studies happiness is I think employers are starting to recognize that there is a value proposition in it for them to have their employees less stressed, happier, because they're going to be more productive, they're going to be more likely to stay. So I think the conversations that I've been having with organizations and partnerships with various startups, and that I'm trying to do these projects around looking at workplace well-being as a function of commuting. I think those conversations have been getting easier. When I first started this research, no one really wanted to talk to me. Companies were not interested in changing commutes, or, you know, like not interested, like they were kind of on the surface, like, oh yeah, sure, we'll kind of talk about employee well-being, but we don't actually want to work with you. It sounds hard. Like, I just want to say I care about it. I don't actually want to know if the things that we're doing are working. I think that conversation has really changed. It's going to continue to evolve, especially in light of the current global situation. Employee well-being has never been more important. Commuting majorly impacts how much time employees have to spend with their friends and with their families. It can affect their bottom line. So I think kind of bringing in statistics from economics and psychology and saying, look, we know that happier and less stressed employees are more productive, more likely to stay. We know that mental health in the workplace costs the economy billions of dollars around the world every year. So let's be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Let's make people's commutes easier. Let's, you know, make work scheduling easier. So I think active commuting and can be part of that conversation around employee well-being and helping workplaces walk the talk in terms of sustainability as well. So I found these conversations to be getting somewhat easier over time, now that there's a growing evidence base that linking kind of sustainability and active commuting to employee health and happiness and productivity.
Okay, and then we have it's quite a relevant question here. Did you include Uber and Lyft options in your study as the single-use vehicle?
This is a good point. So I don't think we were able to differentiate that, and we're going to try to do some more of that in our upcoming work, because there has been some some research from economists working in this space suggesting that Uber and Lyft are contributing to carbon emissions, not reducing it, because they're shifting people who would maybe take transit part of the way into kind of driving alone. So I think we've been considering those as drive alone trips in our analysis, but aren't able to kind of break it out specifically. One of my colleagues at HBS, Rafaela Sundin, is a labor economist in the TOM unit, and she's been looking at Uber and Lyft and like self-driving cars as sort of like a future way to increase productivity and improve well-being. But I think we need to be careful when we're thinking about focusing on productivity and well-being, that that's not coming at the expense of carbon emissions. So we haven't been looking at it as its own kind of separate ride choice, kind of categorizing it more as single occupancy vehicles to the extent people aren't using like Uber Pool. But I think we're doing some research on this now, and more research is definitely needed on this topic.
Okay, another question here. Land use and development has a massive impact on transportation choice. Have you considered behavior change in the context of housing choice?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important point. Again, we just kind of measure heterogeneity. We just measure where people live. But obviously, you know, in some of my other research, I study time poverty. And so, for example, we know that people who are economically disadvantaged tend to live outside of the city center, have the longest commutes, live furthest away from their places of employment, are the most time poor, and that some of these strategies are sometimes you know, free parking. Like, we need to be thinking about making sure that these policies are inclusive. The DC lab has been doing some work on this topic, looking at how we can make commutes better for the more vulnerable in society. And I think this is a really important point. My research doesn't look too much at this. I think we just kind of measure heterogeneity. So who is our interventions, you know, working more for versus not working as much for. But there's some other great research, in part by the DC lab, that I would suggest looking into, that's kind of directly trying to address transit access to broader ranges of the population that is not always currently available. And I mean, part of the reason the statistics are so bad around single occupancy vehicle commutes is a lack of access to alternative options in many places in the country outside of major urban centers. So this is definitely a really important factor that we consider in our models, but I think, you know, more research is needed, and the DC Lab is doing some great work on this topic.
Thanks, Ashley. I think we're going to put a pause on the questions, and anybody who hasn't got their questions answered, we will send you a very long list of people that you can get. Great, I'm glad I love your enthusiasm.
I love
Maxine,
questions. Best
Maxine and
part.
Ashley, there's loads of very interesting questions there. I just wanted to say thanks again to Maxine and Ashley, of course, for this great webinar. Don't forget to submit your abstract to BECC. I think Ashley might be going this year, right?
Yeah, I think I will be.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. I love putting people on the spot.
Jessica and Joey and I will submit something your way on some of the
Excellent.
projects.
Excellent. So you can maybe meet Ashley in person.
Yeah, if we're doing that, or we'll virtually hang out, whatever we're in.
Whatever happens, we will be some sort of networking involved. Remember that the next webinar will likely be on April 16th, and you can head over to the BECC website to register for that, and that will be on climate change and how the COVID virus is affecting the climate and what we can do as a community. Again, I just wanted to say thanks for everybody who participated. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Stay healthy, everybody. And
Look
we will
forward to
talk
your
to you soon.
questions. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye.